Hey everybody, and welcome back to Talk Tickers for another deep dive. This time we're going to be looking at Hecla Mining and their Q3 2024 earnings call. And well, they got a new CEO. Should be interesting.
Always interesting when there's new leadership, for sure. I'm excited to dig into this one.
So you got the transcript in front of you. What are the big things that jumped out at you? What do our listeners need to know?
Well, first things first, Hecla Mining is a major silver player. They do a bit of gold too. But this quarter's earnings are particularly interesting because it's our first look at the company with this new CEO, Rob Crock-Meroff.
New CEO, yeah. Always a shakeup. Tell us about him. What's his background? What does he bring to the table?
You know what really caught my eye? It's his background. He's a geologist. Over 30 years of experience, which is pretty unusual for a CEO in this industry. You usually see people with more of a finance or business background at the top.
Interesting. Yeah, it makes you wonder what his focus will be. I mean, is he going to be all about exploration and finding new deposits, or is he going to be more focused on the financials side of things?
Hard to say for sure at this point, but I think that geology background, suggests he's got a deep understanding of Hecla's assets. He's probably going to prioritize projects that have, a really solid resource base and that can grow long term. But, of course, he's got to balance that with the financial realities. Keeping costs under control and making sure investors are happy.
Yeah, it's a balancing act for sure. So let's get into the specifics of this earnings call. I know they've got a bunch of different mining operations. Where do we want to start?
Let's start with Kino Hill up in Yukon Territory in Canada. It's their biggest silver producer. But it's been in the news lately and not for the best reasons.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. What's going on up there?
Well, Kino Hill had a 35-day mill shutdown, basically everything ground to a halt. And this was because of permit delays that came about because of an incident at a nearby mine. Yeah. It wasn't even Hecla's fault directly, but it just goes to show you how sensitive this industry is to regulations and public perception.
Yeah. One little thing can set off a whole chain reaction affecting permits, relationships with communities, and even the stock price. So what does this mean for Kino Hill's production? Are they back on track?
Not quite. They're also in the middle of changing over to a new mining method, which is supposed to be safer and better for the environment. Good in the long run, but it is causing more delays, pushing things back to 2026.
So delays on top of delays.
Yeah.
Not what investors want to hear. So looking ahead, what should our listeners be paying attention to with Kino Hill?
It's all about how Hecla manages these challenges. Are they being upfront about the delays? Are they doing what they need to do to reduce the risks? Can they get Kino Hill back on track and producing as much as they projected? It's a high-stakes situation for sure.
For sure. So Kino Hill's a bit of a question mark at the moment. What about the other operations? Any bright spots in this earnings report?
Greens Creek in Alaska, that's their star right now. Consistently a strong performer, bringing in some really good free cash flow.
It's got to be a relief for Hecla with all the issues at Kino Hill.
Absolutely. And here's something interesting. Greens Creek has started generating revenue from copper. Not huge amounts yet, but it does show they're branching out and looking for new revenue streams.
That's a smart move, especially with copper prices going up and with how important copper is in all things green energy. Speaking of diversification, what about their other mines? Are they all focused on silver?
They do have a couple others, Lucky Friday in Idaho. That's silver, and they hit a bit of a snag this quarter. Production was down because of lower throughput and ore grades. Basically, they got less silver out of the ore they processed.
Ah, yes. The joys of mining.
Yeah.
You're kind of at the mercy of Mother Nature there, but I thought they were pretty optimistic about Lucky Friday long term.
They are. They still believe that Lucky Friday can produce something like 5 million ounces of silver per year over the next decade. Consistency is key in mining, though, so they'll need to work through those recent hiccups if they want to hit that target.
All right, so got Kino Hill with some challenges, Greens Creek doing well, Lucky Friday somewhere in the middle. What about the last mine?
That'd be Casa Berardi, their gold mine in Quebec. And they're actually in the process of making a big change there, moving to a surface-only operation.
Interesting. Why are they doing that?
Efficiency and profitability, basically. Surface mining is usually cheaper and easier to manage than underground mining. So even though it'll mean lower production for a bit, they believe it'll make Casa Berardi more profitable in the long run.
Okay, so a lot going on with Hecla's different mining operations.
Welcome back, Talk Tickers listeners. Ready for round 2 of our deep dive into Hecla Mining. We're going to dig into the financials this time.
Absolutely. I know our listeners are always eager to hear about the numbers. So what does this earnings report tell us about Hecla's financial health? Where do we even begin?
Let's start with cash flow. That's the lifeblood of any mining company. And Hecla reported strong cash flow from operations this quarter, which is really encouraging, especially considering those hiccups they had at Kino Hill and Lucky Friday.
So even with those setbacks, their core business is still chugging along. That's got to be good news for investors, right?
Definitely Green Streak in particular is really churning out the cash for them, which helps offset the cost of, developing Kino Hill and keeping everything else running smoothly.
Speaking of Kino Hill, let's talk about that elephant in the room. The mine has been a slow and expensive process to get up and running. How much is that weighing on their bottom line?
There's no doubt it's been a significant investment. They've poured a lot of money into development and permitting, and it's still not clear when they'll actually see a return on that investment. It's a calculated risk, but it's a risk nonetheless.
So are they throwing good money after bad? Or is there actually a light at the end of the tunnel for Kino Hill? What do you think?
It's a tough one, honestly. If they can get production ramped up and bring those costs down, Kino Hill could be a real game changer for Hecla. But the longer it takes, the more pressure it puts on their finances.
Right, and that brings us to their debt reduction efforts.
Right.
Did they make any headway on that this quarter?
They did. They managed to pay down a good chunk of their revolving credit facility, which is a positive sign. Shows they're serious about getting their financial house in order and lowering their overall debt.
That's good news for investors. A healthy balance sheet is essential, especially in an industry as cyclical as mining. Speaking of keeping investors happy, what's the story with their dividend?
Ah, yes, their silver-linked dividend. Kind of a unique approach, right? Instead of a fixed dividend, the amount they pay out goes up and down with the price of silver.
So when silver's doing well, investors get a bigger payout. But when prices drop, so does the dividend. Seems like a bit of a gamble.
It can be a double-edged sword, for sure. It's a nice bonus for shareholders when silver's on the rise, but it also makes their dividend payments a bit less predictable.
So Hecla needs to strike that balance between keeping shareholders happy and making sure they have enough cash on hand to run the business and weather any storms that come their way.
Exactly. So let's see what the analysts are saying about Hecla's future. What's their take on all this?
Seems like the consensus is cautiously optimistic. They know about the challenges at Kino Hill and the transition at Casa Berardi, but they also see Hecla's track record and the potential of their assets.
A lot of analysts are really bullish on silver prices, which is good for Hecla, obviously. As a major silver producer, rising prices would really boost their revenue and profits.
Makes sense. But I'm sure there are some concerns too. Mining is a tough business. What are some of the headwinds Hecla might face?
Definitely some things to keep in mind. Rising costs are a big one. Everything from energy to labor is going up. Then you've got the constant challenges of labor shortages and regulatory hurdles. Those things can really hit a mining company's bottom line.
So it's a mixed bag with both opportunities and risks for Hecla as they move forward.
That's the name of the game in this industry. Always something to keep you on your toes.
And that's why it's so important for our listeners to do their own research. Really understand the things that could impact Hecla's performance before they make any investment decisions. Speaking of understanding, let's shift gears a bit and talk about Hecla's management team.
Yeah, they have a new CEO at the helm. We talked about his geology background, but what about his leadership style? How do you think he'll approach strategy and operations?
Well, it's early days, but we've got some clues. He's talked about organic growth, maximizing value from their existing mines, and strong cash flow. But what about his risk tolerance? Is he going to be willing to shake things up a bit and go after new opportunities, or will he play it safe?
Those are the million-dollar questions, and investors are going to be watching very closely to see how he navigates that whole complex world of mining regulations.
His ability to deal with those external factors is going to be crucial. So we've covered the financials, the management, and the outlook from analysts. What's next on our list?
I think it's time to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. The mining industry is always evolving, driven by commodity prices, new technologies, and environmental regulations. How is Hecla positioned to adapt and stay ahead of the curve?
That's a key question for sure. What are some of the major trends we should be paying attention to?
One trend that's especially relevant to Hecla is the increasing demand for silver in industrial applications. Silver isn't just a precious metal anymore. It's a key component in things like solar panels, electric vehicles, and all these other technologies that are driving a more sustainable future.
So as the world shifts to cleaner energy, the demand for silver is just going to keep going up. That's going to be huge for Hecla.
Huge potential upside.
Yeah.
But it also means they need to make sure they have a reliable and sustainable supply of silver to meet this growing demand.
So that means investing in exploration, developing new mining technologies, and making their existing operations as efficient as possible. And it all has to be done responsibly right. Consumers are much more aware these days of the environmental and social impact of mining.
Absolutely. Hecla needs to prove that they're operating in a sustainable and ethical way if they want to keep what's called their social license to operate.
So much to think about here. Company-specific factors, industry trends, the global push for sustainability. It's a lot to digest.
It is, but that's what makes these deep dives so interesting and worthwhile.
Exactly. We're taking all these different pieces of the puzzle, the financial data, the management changes, the industry trends, and trying to paint a clear picture of where Hecla stands today and where they might be headed in the future.
And hopefully by the end of this episode, our listeners will have a much better understanding of this complex but fascinating company. But before we move on, I think it's time for a friendly reminder for our Talk Tickers listeners.
This is just one perspective. We always encourage you to do your own research, talk to a financial advisor, and make decisions that make sense for your own situation and risk tolerance.
And we're back for the final stretch of our Hecla Mining deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? Their recent earnings call, how their operations are doing, the financials, even what this new CEO might bring to the table.
It's been a wild ride for sure.
Yeah.
But let's try and tie it all together. What are the main takeaways for our listeners? What should they be watching out for as we move forward with Hecla?
Okay, so first off, Kino Hill is still the big question mark. It could be a huge growth driver for Hecla down the road. But all those delays and that switch to a new mining method, it's making things a bit uncertain.
Yeah, investors need to look for signs that Hecla is handling those challenges well. Are they being open about the timeline and the costs? Are they taking steps to minimize the risks?
Exactly. Transparency is key. They need to keep investors informed and demonstrate that they've got a solid plan to get Kino Hill back on track.
Right, Kino Hill. Watch and see. What about the other mines? Anything important to highlight there?
Greens Creek is still their rock star, pumping out that cash flow, even adding a little copper revenue to the mix. Diversification is never a bad thing.
And we can't forget about Casa Berardi and their move to surface-only operations. That should make them more efficient and profitable in the long run. But it's going to take careful planning and execution.
Exactly. Investors should keep an eye on how that transition is going. Are they hitting their targets? Are costs under control? Is that long-term profitability goal still realistic?
Right, so we've got the individual mines covered. What about Hecla's overall financial health? Their strategy?
They did make some progress on paying down debt this quarter, which is good. But they're not quite at their target leverage ratio yet. It'll be interesting to see how this new CEO decides to allocate capital.
Yeah. Is he going to prioritize investing in new exploration and development? Or will he focus more on getting that debt down? Big decision that will shape Hecla's future growth.
And let's not forget those big picture industry trends we talked about. That rising demand for silver in industrial applications could be huge for Hecla. But they've got to be ready to meet that demand in a way that's sustainable and responsible.
Right, showing that commitment to ESG, environmental, social, and governance principles is becoming more and more important for both investors and consumers.
It really is. So the big picture, Hecla's got a lot of potential. They've got a diverse portfolio, a strong history, and a new CEO with fresh ideas.
But they've also got some challenges. The uncertainty with Kino Hill, the ongoing changes at Casa Berardi, and that debt they still need to pay down.
Investors have got to weigh all that and decide if Hecla fits their goals and their risk tolerance.
One thing's for sure, Hecla is definitely a company to keep your eye on. How they perform in the next few quarters will tell us a lot about whether they can deliver on their plans and take advantage of those opportunities that are out there.
Now remember, everyone, this is just our take.
Always do your own research, talk to a financial advisor, and make smart decisions based on your own situation. That's the Talk Tickers way.
Absolutely. And now, for the moment you've all been waiting for, time for our This Is Not Financial Advice segment, where we throw all caution to the wind and let our imaginations run wild.
This is purely for fun, folks. Just us exploring some crazy possibilities. Don't go making any investment decisions based on what you hear here.
Disclaimer delivered.
Okay, so we know Hecla is mainly a silver company, right? But they got a little taste of the copper market now with Greens Creek. And copper, as we know, is essential for the whole green energy revolution. The demand is through the roof.
I see where you're going with this. What if Hecla goes all in on copper? Tries to become a major player in that market?
Exactly. What if they take their mining expertise and their resources and go out and buy a promising junior copper mining company? Maybe one with assets in a stable jurisdiction like Canada or the US.
Now that's a bold move, but not completely crazy. they could potentially pick up a company with huge potential for growth at a really good price.
And they could use their operational expertise to get those assets developed, ramp up production, quickly become a big force in the copper world.
Of course, it's high risk, high reward. They'd need to do their due diligence, make sure there aren't any hidden problems or operational issues.
Of course, of course. But hey, we're just brainstorming here, having some fun with the what ifs. It's always good to think outside the box and imagine those different paths a company could take.
Absolutely. And it shows just how dynamic the mining industry is. Always changing. Companies need to adapt and be innovative to stay ahead.
Well, folks, that about wraps up our deep dive into Hecla Mining's Q3 2024 earnings call. Hope you enjoyed it, found it useful.
As always, keep learning. Keep exploring those companies and industries that pique your interests.
Stay curious, stay informed, and until next time, happy investing.